I've always been fascinated by stories about creatures like the Wendigo, the Rake, and skinwalkers. There's something about these legends that sends shivers down my spine. So when my parents finally agreed to let me camp alone in the nearby woods, I was thrilled. I thought it would be a peaceful escape, just me, my tent, a campfire, a camping chair, and some trail cameras to catch pictures of deer. Everything felt perfect. As night came, the clearing where I set up camp became pitch black, with only the flickering light from the campfire casting shadows across the tall trees. I sat there, listening to music on my phone, watching the flames dance. The forest was so still it almost felt unnatural. Suddenly I heard it, a growl, but not just any growl. It was deep, like a bear's rumble, yet there was an odd gurgling and cracking mixed in. It didn't feel right. My heart started racing, and I grabbed my lantern, shining it around the campsite. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice trembling, hoping it was just a fox or some other animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. A chill ran down my spine as the growl faded into an eerie silence. I swung the lantern, cutting through the dark, and that's when I saw it. A shape in the shadows, a long, thin hand with sharp gray claws. My breath caught in my throat as more of it became visible. It had a gray, hairless head with no nose and eyes that glowed red. Its grin was far too wide, filled with jagged teeth that looked like they could tear me apart. The creature stared at me, and I felt frozen. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, just like that, it disappeared behind a tree. I blinked, unsure if I had really seen it or if my imagination was playing tricks on me. But then, the silence was broken by a high-pitched scream, sharp and ear-splitting, as though it was coming from everywhere. My heart leaped into my throat, and before I could react, the creature charged at me, its mouth wide open, its jaw unhinged, as if it planned to swallow me whole. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground as I heard its heavy footsteps and that awful gurgling growl. The branches scraped my face and arms as I stumbled through the dark forest, struggling to see where I was going. Then, I felt a sharp, burning pain across my back. A slash. I kept running, my chest aching, the sound of its pursuit growing closer. I had to do something. Suddenly, I stopped and ducked just as the creature lunged at me. I heard it crash into the ground, and I ran the opposite way, my legs shaking but somehow still carrying me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. After what felt like forever, I burst out of the forest and stumbled into someone's backyard, my lungs burning. A family was having a cookout and all of them turned to stare. I must have looked like a mess, with torn clothes and scratches across my back. I collapsed to the ground, barely able to catch my breath. The last thing I remember before everything went black was their worried faces and someone shouting for help. I had escaped, but I knew deep down it wasn't over. That creature, whatever it was still out there, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to stop. When I woke up, I found myself lying on a couch in a stranger's living room. The warmth felt strange after the cold forest, and my body ached, especially my back, which burned like fire. I could hear voices in the kitchen, speaking quietly and worriedly. Slowly, I sat up, wincing in pain, trying to recall everything that had happened. The forest, the creature, the chase. My heart raced just thinking about it. The family who had found me must have heard me moving because they hurried into the room. There was a man, a woman, and a teenage girl. They looked worried, but there was something else in their eyes, fear. The man spoke first, his voice calm but serious. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "We've seen things in those woods, but nothing like what you described." I told them everything I remembered. The growl, the glowing red eyes, the chase. The more I spoke, the more nervous they became. The teenage girl, who had been quiet until now, finally whispered, "We call it the pier. It's been around for as long as anyone can remember." It doesn't usually let people get away. My stomach twisted. The pier, I repeated, my voice shaking. The woman nodded, her eyes flicking toward the window, as if expecting to see it staring back at her. It watches, she said, her voice low. It waits, and once it marks someone. Her voice trailed off, sending a cold shiver down my spine. I didn't want to know what happened once it marked someone, but I had a sinking feeling I was about to find out. The man cleared his throat, his face grim. "We think you should stay here tonight," he said. "You're not safe out there, not now." I wanted to argue, to say I'd be fine, but the fear in their eyes stopped me. They knew more about this creature than I did, and if they were scared, I had every reason to be terrified. That night, I stayed on their couch, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. I kept seeing those glowing red eyes, that awful grin. The pier was still out there, and it wouldn't forget about me. I knew it would be back. The only question was when. The family tried to comfort me, but I could tell they were scared too. They kept the lights on all night, and now and then one of them would peek out the window, keeping watch. The fear in the air was thick. I knew escaping the forest was just the beginning. The pier had marked me, and somehow I had to figure out how to survive whatever came next. The next morning, I woke up with a jolt. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself everything that had happened was just a nightmare. But then I felt the sting across my back, and my heart sank. It was real. The pier was real. I sat up slowly, my muscles sore from the night before. The family was already awake, moving around the kitchen. They were tired, and I could see the fear in their eyes. Mr. Harris, who I had learned was the father, handed me a plate of food. "You need to keep your strength up," he said, his voice gentle but firm. I nodded, but I barely ate. My mind kept replaying everything: the growl, the chase, the creature's eyes. Every bite felt like ash, and I had to force myself to swallow. Mrs. Harris came over and sat down across from me. She looked at me with kind, worried eyes. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said. "The pier doesn't just go away once it's marked you. It will come back. It might take days, weeks, even months, but it will come." Her words sent a chill through me, and I could feel my hands trembling. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. I asked them what I should do, how I could protect myself. The truth was, they didn't have all the answers. "We've heard stories," Mr. Harris said. "Some say it hates fire. Others say it can't cross running water. But no one really knows for sure." He paused, his eyes darkening. "What we do know is that it will try to find you. You can't let your guard down." The fear in the room was overwhelming. I felt like I was suffocating in it. I had escaped the forest, but I hadn't escaped the creature. It was still out there somewhere, waiting. I knew I couldn't stay with the Harris family forever. I didn't want to put them in danger any more than I already had. But the thought of being alone again terrified me. What if it came for me when I was by myself? What if I didn't survive the next time? The teenage girl, Emily, spoke up. "We'll help you as much as we can," she said, her voice firm. "You're not alone in this." Her words gave me a small spark of hope, but it was fragile, like a candle in a storm. I thanked them, but deep down, I knew this was something I'd eventually have to face on my own. I couldn't hide forever. That afternoon, I left the Harris house with a heavy heart. They gave me supplies, food, water, even a small knife. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. As I walked away from their house, I felt the weight of the forest behind me, like a dark shadow. I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see those red eyes watching me. But there was nothing, just the silent, endless trees. I knew the pier was still out there. It wouldn't forget about me, and I wouldn't forget about it. The scar on my back was a constant reminder that I had been marked, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. The fear was always there. Hello. I chose not to reveal my name because I prefer to grieve privately. For now, I'll refer to myself as K. Apologies if this seems disorganized. I'm still dealing with my grief and the emotional turmoil caused by my diagnosis of depression and PTSD from what happened last year. To start, I'm from a large city in the UK. I grew up testing my parents' limits, like any rebellious young boy, and didn't realize the consequences of my actions. Because of my upbringing, I thought I had become tough enough to never back down from anyone or anything. Even when I was beaten badly, I kept trying to stand. In my naive mind, the fight wasn't over until I either won or passed out. As time passed, I realized that school wasn't for me, and my parents were often disappointed. But their opinions didn't matter to me. Within weeks, I'd either be expelled or banned from attending classes, so I would spend my time at the gym. After leaving school, I became more focused on physical confrontations, from boxing to fighting strangers in the streets, despite my lack of interest in football. Eventually, I knew I had to find something that would provide a paycheck and purpose, so I decided to join the British Army. I began my training as an infantryman in 2018. Despite my rebellious nature, my parents were proud of my decision. However, during my training, I often got into trouble for fighting and causing disruptions. Somehow, I managed to graduate as a fully trained soldier. I spent a few years repeating the same routine, training, physical drills, and more training. Each day was filled with anger, and I hated it. At one point, I was on the verge of being kicked out due to my behavior, but everything changed when I met Jessica. I met Jess at a bar in a club. She was about 5 feet 7 inches with blonde hair and a stunning face. Exactly what I had always imagined the perfect woman would look like. We hit it off immediately, and she laughed at my terrible jokes. She was from America and visiting the UK with friends. By December 2022, Jess and I were in a relationship, and it was everything I had hoped for. She calmed my anger and helped me do well at work, though the downside was the distance. She lived in America, so we couldn't see each other often. In January of last year, I was granted 2 weeks of leave by my company sergeant major to visit Jess and her family in America. After a long flight and a ride in an Uber, I finally saw Jess and was introduced to her father, a tough, military veteran with the typical jarhead appearance. I was nervous, but he quickly put me at ease, welcoming me into the family. That day, we spent time in the backyard eating and talking. Her father invited me on a hunting trip to their family's private hunting grounds, a tradition passed down for generations. I agreed. The next day, we set off in his truck, driving for hours until we reached a dense forest. They called it Archer's Pass. We unloaded our gear and started hiking, eventually stopping for a break as it began to get dark. Jess's dad suggested we set up camp and finish the hike the next morning. That way, we'd reach the private hunting spot and avoid being disturbed. We set up camp, and Jess asked if I wanted to share a tent with her. I glanced at her father for approval, but he just laughed and said, "Don't look at me." So I agreed and we made camp. We ate some chicken wings and burgers, sang, and danced until about 11 p.m. When it was time to sleep, Jess and I snuggled together, and I quickly fell asleep. The next morning, after breakfast, we packed up and continued our hike. Even though it was sunrise, the trees blocked most of the light, casting the woods in darkness. I'm embarrassed to admit how many branches I walked into, much to Jess's amusement. Within an hour, we were getting close to the hunting spot when we heard a woman scream. It was chilling. "Help! Someone please help me. Oh God, please." Each scream was interrupted by silence before a horrifying screech followed. Jess's dad signaled for us to crouch down and be quiet. After the screech, The woods fell eerily silent. He looked around with his rifle but saw nothing. He turned to us and said, "Stay put, I'll check it out." He added, "If I'm not back in 5 minutes or something goes wrong, get out and call for help. You won't have signal here." Before leaving, Jess's dad quickly covered her mouth as a weak version of the woman's scream carried on the wind. There was something strange about it, gurgling as if the person had fluid in their mouth. It made me think she was choking, and I wondered if blood was involved. Jess's dad told us to hide behind a fallen tree and stay out of sight. He moved off into the woods to investigate. 5 minutes passed with only silence. Jess looked anxious, and I tried to reassure her. Then 3 shots rang out, one followed by 2 more. We both stood up, and Jess moved towards where the shots had come from, but I pulled her back. I knew something was off. I told her, "No, your dad can handle himself. I need to look after you." She protested, but I insisted, "You run to the truck and wait for me. I'll get your dad." I took her rifle, loaded it, and reassured her I would be back soon. After she left, I turned and started moving towards where Jess's dad had gone. As I moved deeper into the woods, the area became thicker, and the visibility was poor. I could barely see ahead of me, constantly pushing branches aside. After a while, I reached a small clearing and saw signs of recent footprints. I followed them to the center of the clearing, where I found 2 sets of tracks. I noticed a shiny piece of metal on the ground and realized it was a shell casing. I pieced it together. Jess's dad had fired 3 shots and then fled, possibly running in the wrong direction. Suddenly, I heard his voice, calling my name. I turned but saw nothing. Then the voice called again, closer. I rushed toward the sound, but as I reached a tree, I saw a blood-stained rifle, its owner's hand still gripping it. I stood frozen in shock as I realized what I was seeing. I heard a voice, my name, but it didn't sound right. It was hollow and eerie. I ran toward it, but when I reached the spot, there was nothing. The voice came from behind me, and when I turned, I found myself face to face with the creature, something that defied logic. I tried to make sense of what was happening as I followed the trail, but it was too late. The creature had already gotten to Jess's father, and its horrific sounds filled the air. I fired at the creature, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The hunt turned into a desperate race to survive, as I realized I was no longer hunting. I was the hunted. After a long, terrifying chase, I found Jess, badly injured but alive. I carried her away from the creature, trying to make it to safety. But despite everything, I knew the creature wasn't finished with us yet. Eventually, I stumbled onto a familiar trail and followed it until I reached a road. I collapsed and lost consciousness. When I woke, I was in a hospital with a doctor explaining the extent of my injuries. I had several deep cuts and fractures, but Jess was in better shape. She was taken to the police station to give a statement, while I was left to process the horrors we had survived. The physical pain wasn't what hurt the most. It was the mental scars. I couldn't make sense of what had happened, and I couldn't stop thinking about the creature that had nearly killed us both. I've always had a deep love for the outdoors. As a child, I spent most of my summers wandering through the towering pines and oaks in the backwoods of my state, getting lost in the whispers of the wind and the sounds of unseen animals. My father used to say I had tree bark for skin and sap for blood, and maybe he wasn't far from the truth. Even when life pushed me into the noise of city living with its concrete towers and bright neon lights, which never seemed to know what starlight was, I always found my way back to the woods, those quiet places that whispered secrets older than any of us. Personally, I wasn't keen on bringing others along. Not every time, of course, but nothing beats roughing it alone. When I was younger, I'd bring friends along, only to hear them complain about their problems, get too drunk, or do other things I didn't care for. I'd been going to a spot for years, a place I didn't want to ruin by bringing someone who'd abuse it. So for the most part, I went alone. It was during one of those long weekends, a 3-day holiday, when I decided to go deeper than I ever had before. I'd once seen a small lake, hidden in the heart of a canyon, far off the beaten track. I'd spoken to a few local outdoorsmen and confirmed it existed, a secret that only a few knew about. With a map spread out on my kitchen table and a pack filled with essentials, excitement bubbled under my skin. I set off early on a Friday morning. The road turned to dirt long before I reached the valley. My tires bounced over rocks and dry ruts, sending dust swirling around me, making it feel like I was driving through a fog of my own creation. The air down here was different, earthy and damp, layered with the scent of wildflowers and decay. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to lean in, almost watching me. It took about an hour of navigating narrow paths, my eyes flicking between the GPS and the thickening forest, before I finally came upon a clearing. The sun gleamed off the grass in golden waves, and beyond a slope of oak trees, I saw the glimmer of the lake. Up above, the road dipped into the canyon. There were a few campers scattered around, but I only saw a couple of rugged, outdoorsy types, people with questionable trucks and trailers. I couldn't believe they had managed to get their gear down here like that. Real pros who apparently knew the area. I set up my camp far from them with practiced ease. Tent pegged, hammock strung between 2 old oaks, and a ring of rocks for the fire. I lay back in my hammock, letting the gentle sway and the soft rustling of leaves lull me into a stupor. The warmth of the afternoon seeped deep into my skin, and before I knew it, twilight was starting to paint the sky with soft strokes. I jerked awake, feeling a chill in the air, and realized I'd napped longer than intended. Still, there was plenty to do. I'm kind of a doomsday prepper, not for my lifestyle, but I take my outdoor activities seriously. I always expect the worst, so I gather extra wood, secure the area, make sure my food is stored properly, and keep my truck's battery in check. I spent the next while collecting firewood, zigzagging through the brush, my arms full of sticks and dry branches. The ground crunched beneath my boots, the rhythmic sound matched only by the chirps of crickets warming up for the night. Just beyond a thicket, I reached a place where the trees opened up, offering a view of the lake. The water was still, a mirror to the last rays of the sun, which turned it into a streak of molten orange. The canyon rim above had darkened, swallowing the light and leaving the valley in velvety blue. It was beautiful, isolating, and heavenly. I was glad to have found this little slice of wilderness all to myself. After gathering the last of the wood, I returned to my camp. The fire caught quickly, flames licking up hungrily. I sat back and roasted a couple of hot dogs, turning them slowly, savoring the warmth of the fire on my face. Beans bubbled in a tin at the edge of the flame, their scent both comforting and a little foreboding of what my tent would smell like later that night. I took my time eating, chewing each bite, as the night deepened and the stars began to unfurl above me, tiny pinpricks of ice. I loved eating junk food like this in the woods. It was the only time I let myself indulge. The first sign that something was off came quietly, a rustle, barely perceptible, at the edge of the firelight. I glanced up, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a coyote. Instead, I saw a figure, small, barely at the edge of where the light met the darkness. A boy, no older than 7, barefoot and messy, his eyes catching the flicker of the flames like mirrors. "Can I warm up by your fire?" he asked, his voice thin and careful, as if the question might break if spoken too loudly. I froze, my throat dry. Who was he? Where had he come from? The nearest road was miles away, yet I couldn't think of anything to say. I nodded, motioning to the other side of the fire. "Are you lost, kid?" He shook his head, his mouth curling into a smile that was both too old and too young. No, my family's camp is down here. I was just coming back from the lake. I thought this was our camp. I scanned the dark, hoping to see a distant glow of another fire or hear voices. But there was nothing. The forest swallowed it all up. It's getting late, I said, more to myself than to him. Aren't you worried about getting lost out here? He didn't blink. Doesn't really matter down here. The trails are always the same. His words made my skin prickle, and I shuddered. The flames crackled, and I flinched. He was right, but damn, it sounded creepy coming from a 7-year-old. Do you want more hot dogs? I asked, trying to shake off the unease. Do you have ketchup? He asked. I blinked, momentarily thrown by the request, but I nodded and quickly skewered another hot dog, holding it over the fire. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just watched me with those reflective eyes. I wrapped the hot dog in foil and handed it across the fire. He took it with a polite nod and a quiet, "Thank you," before slipping back into the dark, moving away from the lake, away from any path I knew. He stopped just beyond the light and turned around. Do you have another one? I quickly prepared a second hot dog, wrapping it in a bun and adding ketchup, and handed it to him. He thanked me once again and disappeared into the woods. My eyes followed him until I saw something else, pale shapes beyond the reach of the firelight. They were there, watching. One of them shifted, and I saw the glint of an eye, the movement of a head. They stood motionless, like shadows, waiting. My breath caught, and I almost called out, but my voice shriveled in my throat. Just as suddenly as they appeared, they melted back into the darkness, swallowed by the forest without a sound. I stayed there, rigid, eyes darting between the trees and the fire. My heart pounded, a staccato rhythm in my chest. Minutes stretched into hours as the fire burned down to glowing embers, and I sat guard, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyes started to droop, and I crawled into my tent, letting sleep take me. The morning came quickly, the sunlight and birdsong waking me with the heaviness of restless dreams. The clearing looked unchanged, peaceful as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. But the small footprints pressed into the soft dirt near the fire told me otherwise. I spent the morning looking for any sign of where the boy might have gone, but found nothing. I made my way to a nearby camp I'd passed on the way in. It was a couple, weathered and friendly, sitting by their own fire, sipping instant coffee. Sorry to bother you, but did you happen to see a kid last night? Their faces darkened, and they exchanged a glance before the woman answered. Yeah, we saw him. He came by asking for food, barefoot. We gave him some granola bars. Cold knot twisted in my stomach. Did you see anyone else? I asked. The man nodded slowly. Shapes, people out there in the woods. Too many to feel comfortable. I compared notes with them, told them what had happened to me, and we agreed that something didn't add up. Who the hell was living down here with a first grader? We decided to call the authorities. The ranger who arrived later had an expression that said he'd heard this all before. We've had reports, he said, shifting uneasily. There's a story going around about a family living down here, maybe on the run. Fishermen say they see a kid by the lake every weekend. The rest of the weekend was spent on edge. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made my nerves jump. I saw the boy again from a distance. He was standing on a slope above the lake, his eyes glittering in the daylight. There was no smile this time, just emptiness. His family, or whatever they were, stood further up the hill, their stillness even more unnerving than his. On the last morning, I packed up and left, closing the door on the forest behind me. I didn't go back to that spot, not once, not ever, but whenever I camp now, and the wind moves my tent, I still think about that boy and those silent watchers. I often wonder if they're still out there, in the place where the trails are always the same. In the summer of 2018, I bought my van, this old steel frame home on wheels that promised freedom inside simplicity. I outfitted it with everything I needed: a sleeping bag, a small kitchen setup, a solar-powered heater, and a sturdy external lighting system. For over a year, I traveled the country, chasing the call of towering redwoods, peaceful deserts, and rushing rivers. But nothing could have prepared me for the night everything changed. It was spring of 2019 when I found myself driving through the rugged backcountry of Colorado, far from the familiar paved roads. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and a cool breeze filtered in through the cracked windows as the tires crunched over the gravel. I'd heard whispers from other travelers about a hidden trail that promised solitude and stunning views, and I wanted to experience it for myself. By late afternoon, I emerged from a thick forest and into a clearing, where to my surprise, I discovered a small settlement. It wasn't on any map, just a handful of weathered houses, a small chapel with peeling white paint, and a country store standing crookedly like a forgotten relic from another time. One half of the store was closed, while the other side displayed a flickering neon open sign. I slowed my van, curiosity tingling at the edges of my caution. The bar side of the store glowed warmly, and I could hear muffled voices trickling out when the door creaked open, then shut again. A man in a tattered hat glanced my way, his eyes reflecting the glow of my headlights before he disappeared inside. The presence of the town felt unsettling, but reason told me it was nothing more than an old, fading community. Better keep going, I muttered to myself. I don't want to hear any banjos. The road twisted for another 15 minutes, dipping into pockets of shadow where the trees pressed close. The setting sun painted the sky in vibrant orange and red, casting long shadows between the trunks. When I finally found a clearing to park in, it was just before twilight. The spot was perfect, open enough to spot any wildlife and sheltered on one side by a dense grove of pines. I turned off the engine but kept the headlights on as I prepared my camp. The evening came to life with the sizzle of steak in the pan, the crackle of the heater, and the rhythmic clink of utensils on metal. The light from my van cast sharp contrasts across the clearing, pushing deep into the woods. My external lights were so powerful, they made regular floodlights look weak. I had no interest in the eerie shadows from a campfire. This was solo camping in the modern age, with stovetop meals and bright beams that kept the critters away. After dinner, I stood there, savoring the solitude. The night fell quickly, like a heavy blanket. The stars above felt unnervingly close. I stretched, feeling the cold seep through my flannel shirt, then relieved myself by a nearby tree before climbing back into the van. Nothing worse than getting all cozy for the night and realizing you have to pee. I let the warm air escape as I settled in. My little speaker whispered a soft tune as the voice of an artist mingled with the wind. It was my comfort when I needed to relax or drift off. Hours passed inside the van. I read a dog-eared paperback, listened to a true crime podcast, then finally fell asleep, wrapped in the warmth from the heater. Around 2 a.m., I woke up abruptly. Silence had settled like a heavy blanket outside, thick and unnatural. I could hear the crunch of footsteps, no, 2 sets of footsteps. My breath caught. Then I heard shuffling and the metallic scrape of something being dragged. My heart raced, and I sat up, staring out the window. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, and what I saw froze me with fear. Small beams of light cut through the darkness, jerking and bouncing as though they were held by restless hands. Figures moved just beyond my vision, erratic and almost inhuman. I wished at that moment that I'd left my external lights on, but they were battery drainers. My skin prickled as I spotted one figure pause and shine their flashlight directly at the van. The beam hit the window, glaring through, and I ducked instinctively. My mind spun with possibilities. Teenagers? Hunters? But what kind of hunters linger around an occupied campsite? I quickly grabbed my boots, strapped my belt tight, and pulled out the large hunting knife from its sheath. Every nerve screamed for action, but I forced myself to stay still. I crept to the side door and tested the handle. Locked. Confusion hit me. I didn't lock it from the outside. Why couldn't I open it? A shiver ran up my spine as another flashlight swept across the side window. It stopped, and I saw a pair of eyes gleaming wild. The face appeared almost skeletal, with sunken cheeks casting long shadows. The beam moved again, blinding me, and I recoiled. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Get away from here. I'm armed." There was no reply, just the murmur of voices slipping into the wind. My hands trembled as I gripped my knife tightly, and I frantically searched for my phone. No service. I fumbled with it, desperately hoping for a signal, but the screen mocked me. I checked the back door, and it too was sealed shut. A metallic click echoed above me, and I looked up, eyes wide. The overhead hatch slowly swung open with a strange creak, and cold air rushed in. Then, a sound like a coin flipping repeatedly, a metallic ring that chilled me to my core. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. They had locked me in the van, and now they were forcing me out through the roof hatch. I was drenched in sweat but shivering, like I was going through withdrawal. The hatch loomed above me, dark and open like a mouth. A voice inside screamed at me not to look, not to risk meeting whatever stared back from the void. But the hatch slammed shut with sudden force, shaking the roof. There were no footsteps above me, which only made it worse. I swallowed a scream and peeked through the side window. The figures were on the move again, their lights dancing like fireflies in a chaotic frenzy. They were sprinting back toward the distant town, their movements too erratic to seem human. The lights flickered in a strange pattern, making the shadows lurch. I tried the side door handle again, and this time it clicked open. Cool air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of pine and something metallic. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold. The scene was unsettling. Everything I had left out was in disarray. Plates overturned, a pot rolled into the brush, but nothing had been taken. The ground around the van was marked with deep, curving impressions, like something heavy had been dragged through. My heart sank at the thought of what kind of ritual could leave such marks. Enough of this, I muttered to myself. My hands shook as I hurriedly packed up, slamming the van doors shut. I wasn't going to stay and wait for another round of whatever strange game they were playing. Within minutes, the headlights cut through the dark as I sped deeper into the forest, passing the trees that stood like silent watchers. I drove for nearly an hour, my tires skidding over unseen rocks and roots, my mind racing with images of hollow-eyed figures and strange metallic sounds. When I finally stopped, my breath came in ragged gasps. The night was still again, but exhaustion weighed heavily on me. I didn't head toward town. I drove deeper into the woods, isolated and alone. That, to me, was the best defense. The farther I got from those people, the safer I'd be. I locked the doors twice, knife still in hand, then collapsed into my bedroll. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the smallest sounds, the wind rustling the leaves, the van creaking on its wheels. Morning brought a weak light filtering through the pines. My body ached with tension as I stepped outside to check on the van. The calm of the morning was eerie, and what I saw sent a chill through me. Around the van were the same deep impressions from the night before. Only this time they were fresher, clearer, and too perfectly spaced to be random. My mind flashed back to the strange settlement, to those figures running back toward it. I wanted to believe it was just a prank, a group of locals messing with me, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The marks in the dirt seemed almost mocking, silent, and deliberate. I snapped a few pictures, a futile attempt to reassure myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The sunlight offered some comfort, but it felt thin compared to the memories of the night before, which still clung to me like a stain. With a heavy sigh, I headed back toward civilization. I drove until I reached the next real town, a bustling place where life seemed so ordinary compared to the terror I'd just faced. I parked at a diner, the sound of people and clinking dishes bringing a sense of normalcy. The smell of bacon and coffee helped calm my nerves. A waitress with warm eyes approached. I ordered coffee, my voice still rough from the sleepless night. When she returned, I asked, "Have you ever heard of a settlement maybe 30 miles northeast of here? A small place with a chapel and a store?" Her face instantly changed. The warmth drained from her expression, and she looked to an older man at the counter, who frowned. "You don't want to go there," she said softly. "That place has been abandoned for years." I looked at her, confused. "But She cut me off. "If you're ever out that way again, keep driving. It's not safe." The fear in her eyes said everything. I've always enjoyed the feeling of pushing my body to its limits. Back in college, I became known among my friends for planning camping trips that most people would consider extreme. Trips into fierce storms where the wind cut through every exposed inch of skin, or deep into snow-covered woods where silence hung like a heavy weight. These adventures came from afternoons spent with a rock-climbing group, a crew of thrill-seekers who thrived on the challenge of combining physical exertion with harsh weather. The tougher the trip, the more accomplished I felt after surviving it. Exhausted, but exhilarated. It became something like an addiction, a point of pride among us adrenaline junkies. So, when the idea of camping in Death Valley during its peak summer heat hit me, I saw it as the ultimate test. But I wasn't foolish. I knew how deadly Death Valley could be, so I decided to first test myself with practice runs in lesser-known deserts along the Arizona-Utah border. These areas were barren, with nothing but sand, scrub, and relentless heat. They would teach me patience and survival techniques, building makeshift sunshades, learning how to trap cool air, and pushing my water rations until my body began to show signs of stress. One of these trips led me farther into isolation than ever before, about 60 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by land that seemed untouched by humans. The sun blazed white in the sky as I set up camp. The heat shimmered in waves, creating mirages on the horizon. I spent hours practicing how to build emergency shelters, digging shallow trenches and covering them with tarps, weighing them down with rocks. Sweat dripped down my neck, hissing as it touched the parched earth. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt a deep weariness settle into my bones, but also a sense of accomplishment. I decided to hike down into a nearby dry creek bed, hoping it would be a bit cooler at a lower elevation. My boots crunched against the cracked earth, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. Then I saw them, bright white shoes half buried in the sand, catching the last of the fading sunlight. I frowned and stepped closer, curiosity gnawing at me despite my exhaustion. The shoes were stained with dark, crusted patches, and when I prodded one with a stick, it rolled slightly, revealing a grotesque mixture of dried blood and unidentifiable fragments inside. My heart raced. It didn't make sense. The shoes were placed so carefully in this untouched land, and the amount of blood seemed far too much for a simple animal attack, like a coyote or a snake bite. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched longer, and the landscape began to feel unfamiliar and eerie. The sky wasn't dark yet, but it would be in a couple of hours. I stood there for a moment, scanning the flat expanse, looking for any sign of life. There was nothing, only the wind brushing against the dry brush. My throat tightened, and I turned to head back to camp, feeling like something unseen was watching me. The ground beneath my feet felt less solid, as if it might give way and reveal something dark and hidden. When I neared my tent, I saw more clothes scattered along the path. Torn jeans, a blouse, each piece stained with the same blood. A wave of dread washed over me, and I broke into a run, skidding to a halt at my camp. My gear was untouched, but now I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. There was a primal, unsettling feeling in the air, and I spent the next hour securing everything, tightening the stakes, hiding my reflective emergency blankets, and making sure my flashlight and pistol were ready. I crouched low, listening to the silence that had swallowed the desert. No coyotes, no birds, just an emptiness so complete it seemed to press in on me. I climbed a nearby bluff to get a better look, my legs shaking from exhaustion and tension. From the top, I scanned the land with care, the lenses of my binoculars cutting through the fading light. About a mile away, I saw something strange, an odd pile of objects scattered across the ground. I focused the lens, and what appeared were clothes, shoes, wigs, high heels, and makeup kits, all marked with dark, dried blood. A chill ran down my spine. Despite the heat, a cold sweat covered my skin, and the breeze carried with it a faint odor of decay. I lowered the binoculars and rubbed my eyes, as if trying to shake off a nightmare. But when I looked again, the disturbing sight remained. The silence around me was deafening, as if it was pressing in on me. Whoever or whatever had left these things out there, it wasn't nature. It felt like the remnants of something sinister. I thought of investigating the scene up close, but my gut told me to leave. I had no idea whether it was a killer's discarded belongings or some grim shrine, but something told me that my instincts were right. I didn't want to be part of whatever this was. As the sun set completely, I gathered my things, knowing I should leave before darkness fully descended. But I hesitated, the car parked far away. My gut told me not to make the mistake of getting stranded in the desert at night, so reluctantly, I decided to stay until morning. I built a small fire more for comfort than necessity and ate some dehydrated food, my eyes always on the vast landscape beyond. The fire's flickering light cast jittery shadows on the rocks and brush, like some kind of warning. I quickly doused the flames, wanting to remain hidden. After finishing my meal, I moved my camp closer to my car and set up a small fire pit far enough away to avoid drawing attention. By the time I finished and the stars had fully taken over the sky, I could feel the desert's eerie stillness. Then, hours later, a faint voice echoed across the basin, a drawn-out holler that seemed warped and distorted. My heart leapt into my throat. Another voice joined in, shrill and unnatural, followed by curses and laughter that turned my stomach. The voices were getting closer, maybe a mile or two away. My grip tightened on my pistol as I listened to them move across the desert, until the sudden roar of an engine shattered the silence. A car screeched in the distance, spinning away with alarming speed. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. I couldn't wait until morning. The dread was crawling under my skin, and I didn't want to be alone out here, stuck in the middle of nowhere. I hurried to pack, leaving behind what I didn't need. My hands shook as I fumbled with my car keys. At 2:30 a.m., I finally pulled onto the dirt road, the headlights cutting jagged paths through the dark. The road was rough, and my teeth rattled with every bump, but I didn't care. I pushed the gas pedal harder, just wanting to see the lights of the nearest town. Then, headlights appeared ahead of me, bright and moving fast from a side path. Another shadow followed, closing in on me too quickly. I pushed the accelerator harder, my pulse racing. The headlights kept pace with me, gleaming in the rearview mirror. I couldn't let them catch up. But as I reached the main highway, the lights behind me started to fade, swallowed up by the dark. By the time I reached a gas station, the first light of dawn was barely visible. I called the police, breathless, and told them everything. The shoes, the bloody clothes, the voices, the car chase. The officer on the other end of the line was silent for a moment, then promised to send someone to investigate. I sat in the parking lot, watching the sky turn pink, the hum of life around me. But the questions never left. Who had been out there? And what had they done? I never found out if the police followed up, but part of me hopes they did. Everyone else just told me it was a bizarre sight, but a part of me still struggles to believe it was anything that simple. I've always felt a kind of peace in the wilderness, a sense of freedom in the quiet of the mountains that stretch endlessly beyond the city's noise. Those overnight hiking trips were like a secret tradition. Leaving work at dusk, driving to the trailhead, hiking up to a peak, and settling in for the night under the stars. It was a silent bond between me and the wild, one that kept my mind clear and my heart steady. I could feel my pulse slow to the rhythm of the night winds, the steady hum of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was perfect. Each trip felt like another chapter in a personal journal written in sweat and starlight. That evening felt no different as I set out for a new peak, one that hadn't been marked on my map before. The trailhead was empty, its gravel lot showing the traces of many travelers who had passed through before. The sky turned red as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the rocky terrain. It was the perfect start to an overnight adventure, the air crisp and full of anticipation. I made good time, my boots kicking up dust, the weight of my pack familiar against my back. The mountain loomed ahead, its jagged edges glowing softly under the twilight sky. By late afternoon, I could see the summit, a crown atop the rough spine of the rock. I reached a flat area at the base of a huge boulder, its surface scarred by time and weather. This would be my camp for the night, a lonely perch high above the lights of the city below, just a few miles away. Something about the glow of the nearby neighborhood made me pause. It was closer than I usually liked, its neon smudge faint on the dark desert canvas. I set up my tent, my hands moving naturally as a seasoned camper, then settled in for the night with a tin of beans and a protein bar. The moon, full and bloated, watched from high above as I let the quiet seep into my bones. I put on a podcast to fill the silence and leaned against the cool stone behind me, sipping from a 12-pack of beer. Somewhere far down the mountainside, I heard the faint rumble of engines. I sat up and squinted into the darkness. 2 or maybe 3 cars were slowly making their way across the desert floor, their headlights cutting bright streaks through the otherwise pitch-black night. I shrugged and leaned back. It wasn't uncommon for night drivers to take these paths. Sometimes campers, sometimes teens out for a thrill. I pulled my fleece tighter and listened to the podcast's gravelly voice recount an old ghost story when a sharp noise sliced through the night. The crack of gunfire. My heart thumped suddenly and hard. Then the silence returned, almost like a heavy curtain. I strained my eyes, searching the darkness, and saw it. A tiny flash, orange and menacing, like the blink of a predator's eye. Another flash, then a dull thud as something struck the rock behind me, sending pebbles skittering. The realization hit me like a sick wave. Those shots were aimed at me. I dropped to the ground, chest heaving, pressing myself hard against the earth. The night erupted in a storm of shots, the boulder behind me cracking and spitting chunks of stone. Panic clawed at me as I scrambled on all fours, dragging myself to the other side of the rock where the shadow was deepest. The shots continued, their echoes rolling up the mountain like thunder. Why were they shooting? Did they even know I was here? I pressed my face into the dirt, the air thick with dust and sweat, straining to hear any pause in the gunfire. When it finally stopped, a breathless hush settled over the mountain. I didn't dare move. My pack, water, food, and phone all lay just out of reach on the other side of the boulder. I had to get to it. Adrenaline surged, pushing me into action. I lunged for the pack, hands grabbing the canvas strap, fingers brushing the nylon when another volley of shots rang out. I yanked the bag back just as bullets stitched the ground where I'd been moments before. The chaos was deafening. My thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. Crouched behind the rock, I sucked in deep breaths, trying to quiet the jackhammer of my heartbeat. The gunfire faltered, then stopped altogether, replaced by voices carried on the wind. Laughter, eerie and mocking, sending a chill through me. I risked a glance down the slope. The cars were still there, their headlights washing the sands in a harsh white light. Figures moved in the glow, their shapes distorted by distance. I could see them waving guns, gesturing toward my refuge. Their voices rose again, filled with strange, manic glee. I couldn't tell if they knew I was here or if this was some twisted game they were playing beneath the cold, indifferent gaze of the moon. Hours stretched on. Time became a blur as I counted the moments between shots, each second stripping away the confidence I once had. I couldn't risk a fire, couldn't move an inch beyond the shadow of the boulder. Every second felt like it could be my last. The winds shifted, carrying the acrid scent of gasoline and gunpowder, closing my throat in fear. Finally, the laughter drifted away, unraveling into the night until it disappeared completely. Silence returned. It was past midnight when I dared shift position. My muscles ached from holding still, my joints stiff. Sleep was impossible now. I waited out the hours, each minute a battle with my nerves. The first light of dawn crept up over the horizon, softening the harsh lines of the desert. The golden rays painted the boulder with hues of pink and orange, highlighting the cracks where bullets had gouged into it. I examined the damage. This rock, not just scarred by last night's shots, but by years of reckless violence. Packing up only took a few minutes. I moved mechanically, my eyes darting to the emptiness below. I found holes in my tent, cleanly torn by bullets that could have struck me in the dark. Lucky me, the words felt hollow in my mouth, a bitter aftertaste. The descent down was grueling, each step an invitation for a final shot. The desert lay mute, its secrets buried beneath the sun-baked earth. When I reached the gravel lot, my heart sank. My car, a trusty old sedan, was ruined. Tires flattened, windows shattered, paint gouged by bullets. The desert had claimed it, too. My report to the authorities was a blur of questions and static. Officers swarmed the site, searching for shells, piecing together the chaos. The investigation dragged on, each day a reminder of the flashing gunfire and the mocking laughter, but they found nothing. No leads, no names, just the whispers of those who came out at night, armed and reckless. Weeks passed before I received a call. They'd caught the kids, barely teens, armed with a sense of invincibility that only comes with foolishness. They'd come back, firing at the rock, laughing at their own stupidity. An officer had seen them, called for backup, and the arrest was clean. The shock of it all was sudden and brutal, or so I was told. The locals in that community pressed charges, and those kids and their families had to pay a heavy price. Eventually, I was reimbursed tire replacements, window repairs, tow fees. But that night, and the memory of that boulder, are etched in my mind deeper than the bullets that scarred my car. I haven't been back since. The city lights seem a little brighter now, and the mountains feel just a little darker.